Greetings. Father Mark signing on with the fourth installment in the unit on the Carolingians. Picking up where we left off last time, King Pepin the Shorthair died on September 24th, 768, at which point, following the Lex Salica, the Salian law, his kingdom, the Regnum Francorum, the kingdom of the Franks, was divided among his surviving male heirs. Well, his two sons. His oldest son was named Karl in German, after his grandfather, which is rendered in Latin as Carolus, and later in French as Charles. His later achievements led to the title the Great. Charles the Great, or in Latin Carolus Magnus, and later in French Charles Le Mans, which is anglicized to Charlemagne. So that's Charles the Great. He was born on the 2nd of April, 748, in either Aachen, which is northwest Germany, or in Liège, which is East Belgium. Charles was the eldest of 6 children. Charles, or I'll call him Charlemagne just for this, because there's so many with the name Charles, that just for the sake of clarity, even though obviously he wasn't called Charlemagne until after, but just for clarity, Charlemagne himself eventually had 18 children with 8 of his 10 known wives or concubines. Through them, his descendants included the Austrian Habsburg dynasty, the French Capetian dynasty, and the Plantagenet dynasty, which ruled England and also parts of France. By the time Pepin died in 768, the only males left of Pepin's sons were this Charles and Carloman. Carloman was the second surviving son of Pepin the Short and Bertrada of Lyon. At the age of 3, Carloman, along with his father, Pepin, and his older brother Charlemagne, were anointed kings, reges, kings of the Franks. The brothers, Charles, Charlemagne, and Carloman, disliked each other intensely. Carloman, though younger, always maintained that he was the only legitimate heir, because Charlemagne was born in 742, when Pepin and Bertrada were married by a tribal ceremony, but not yet in the church, whereas Carloman was born after their sacramental marriage. Additionally, the brothers early displayed opposite temperaments. Charlemagne was a natural warrior, a leader, having fought at his father's side against the Aquitanian-Vasconian alliance. Carloman, by contrast, was of a more retiring disposition, but had no less ambition on that account. In any case, Pepin considered them both legitimate and made provisions accordingly in his will. Continuing the Merovingian adherence to the Lex Salica, Pepin's will divided the Regnum Francorum between them. Carloman got the center of the French kingdom, his capital at Soissons, Paris. Soissons was the capital, but it included Paris, the Central Massif, the mountains in the central France, Provence, Burgundy, southern Austrasia, Alsace, and Alemannia. And also in accord with the Lex Salica, the Franks, in Generali Conventu, in General Assembly, recognized both of them as kings, as reges, of the single, so they're both kings, but of a single kingdom, the Regnum Francorum. Remember, that was a problem with the Merovingians, and why you don't see any Merovingians around anymore, because that just couldn't survive that way. So it's theoretically it's one kingdom. Well, I shouldn't say legally. Legally, it was one kingdom with two constituent kings. This arrangement, of course, was doomed to the same failure that haunted the Lex Salica under the Merovingians. What complicated matters more in this case, in addition to the personal antipathy, was the expansion of the realm by Pepin and Pepin's father, Charles Martel. So the division between Charlemagne and Carloman was not simply Neustria and Austrasia, as it had been under the early Merovingians, but also all the conquered territory. So Charlemagne, received Neustria, part of Neustria, northern Austrasia, western Aquitaine. Carloman got eastern Aquitaine, with allegiance pledged from Phrygia and Alemannia, Phrygia in the Netherlands, Alemannia in Germany. Carloman received southern Austrasia, Septimania, Burgundy, Provence, and Swabia, with allegiance pledged from Bavaria. So the territory, in other words, put another way, the territory of Charlemagne was smaller in extent, but better organized. The territory of Carloman was more extensive and potentially wealthier, but with little coherence in terms of governance. And remember that all the southern France part of the Aquitania, all that Septimania had all been ruined, materially ruined by the wars in the last, the 7 years of Pepin's reign. The following year, on April 12, 769, Pope Stephen III summoned a synod of bishops to meet at the Lateran to restore canonical order after all the chaos that we covered at the previous reign, all these anti-popes. This is not one of the 5 ecumenical councils held at the Lateran in the second millennia, after the year 1000. Same place, but this is just a synod for the Diocese of Rome, at which the captured anti-pope Constantine was still alive, but he was blinded and lame after his brutal capture, publicly confessed his guilt, and begged forgiveness. He could have been put to death, but, I guess, but they just let him retire to a monastery. Maybe they felt guilty for having blinded this guy when, he was really just the tool of others, Forgiveness and mercy have really never been conspicuous human traits. Second, they redid the what we would think of as the conclave. They weren't calling it that yet, but the regulations for how popes are selected, such that only the ordained could henceforth participate in the election of a pope. And that was in hopes of avoiding the farce that happened in the previous, where you have all these different factions electing different antipopes. So, by way of background, and you seminarians, we covered this in the Patristus course when we did the First Council of Nicaea. I summarized. I said I was going to jump to chronology and tell you about this, and then promised that later you would get it. So here it is. This is where it falls in the chronology. So rewinding for a moment to St. Peter, the first pope. It was said, it was believed, that St. Peter constituted, before his death, 24 priests and deacons of Rome as papal electors to choose his successor. That is the remote origin of the College of Cardinals. He wouldn't have been called that in Peter's time. And actually later in the course, we'll get to when the conclave regulations with the locking them in and all that, when that started. But this is the remote origin of it. During the reign of Pope Sylvester I, from 314 to 335, he was the first pope elected after the legalization of Christianity. So during his reign, because it was legal now, Church was legal now, so they didn't have to have elections in secret in the catacombs, so it could be public. And so they experimented, okay, how do we do this? So once it was legal, the laity of Rome were allowed to participate. So they elected representatives, and they joined the clergy in electing the Pope. And so that was from the reign of Pope Sylvester, 314, until this synod in 769. Because the anti-popes, Constantine and Philip, were proclaimed pope in this manner, this Lateran Synod decreed that henceforth only ordained persons could participate in papal elections, and that only an ordained person could be elected pope. Now, subsequently, some of this was reversed by a later pope, Pope Nicholas I, in 862, which we'll get to. And the synod condemned iconoclasm again, which previous popes, of course, had done, and formally anathematized or excommunicated those who participated in the headless council of Hieria. The first challenge that the kingly brothers, Charlemagne and Carloman, faced happened in the same year from the newly subjugated territories, which had resisted both their father Pepin as well as his father, Charles Martel. In between, periodic alliances with the Muslims against the Carolingians, or with the Carolingians against the Muslims. So in other words, southern France just wanted to be left alone. You know, they weren't imperial. You know, Aquitaine wasn't trying to conquer Septimania. Provence wasn't trying to conquer Burgundy. They just wanted to be left alone. But, you know, that's other people, imperials. The dream of empire, the dream of Augustus, you know, has never gone away. So, 769, only 1 year after Pepin's death, Aquitania and Vasconia revolted against Frankish hegemony, once more striving for autonomy. Aquitania, you remember in the will, was divided between Charlemagne and Carloman, but Vasconia was entirely within Carloman's sphere. Initially, the brothers joined forces, but they argued over tactics, and Carloman used that as an excuse to simply leave, to take his troops and leave. That left Charlemagne with a decision, either to fight alone or to just give up claim on those duchies and just go back to, you know, under the Merovingians when the Loire River was the southern boundary of the Regnum Francorum. And Charles chose to fight, and he inherited his father and his grandfather's military ability. He achieved decisive victory and reimposed dominion over both Aquitania and Vasconia. As an added measure of security, to keep the restive south under guard, the dowager, their mother, in other words, the former queen, now Dowager Queen Bertrada, the mother of Charles and Carloman, she convinced Charlemagne to put aside his tribal wife, Himiltrude, in order to enter into a political alliance with the Lombards. Now, this Himiltrude had born Charlemagne a son, whom he named Pepin. Now, sadly, this child was afflicted with a spinal curvature, so he's known in history books as Pepin the Hunchback. In 770, Charlemagne did it. He did what his mother suggested. He put Himiltrude aside in order to enter into a politically expedient marriage alliance with the Lombards in northern Italy. The bride used for this was Desiderata. She was the daughter of the Lombard Rex, Desiderius. Charlemagne sent Himiltrude to a convent in Nivelles, Belgium, though he allowed their son, Pepin the Hunchback, to remain at court. Charlemagne's mother, Bertrada, thought that this marriage had the added advantage of not only a Lombard alliance to keep the southern France in check, but also that it would neutralize another potential separatist movement from Bavaria. Because Tassilo III, who was still the Duke of Bavaria, and a former rebel himself, remember, against Pepin, he was married to Luperga, who was another daughter of Desiderius. So Bertrada was thinking, well, okay, if my son Charlemagne and the Duke of Bavaria are married to sisters, then those sisters would keep their husbands from fighting each other. In the same year as the marriage, 770, the Archbishop of Ravenna died. Therein Desiderius perceived opportunity. He played the same game he had when Pope Paul I died. He paid some of the clergy in Ravenna to support one of his creatures, a layman, as it happened, to be appointed as the next Archbishop of Ravenna. In doing this, he was betraying his alliance with the Greeks, to whom he had conceded control of Ravenna if they ever managed to topple the Holy See. Initially, Charlemagne proved entirely uninterested in the affair of Ravenna. So Pope Stephen started to worry. Because Charlemagne, as a young man, he did fight in the army under his father, so he was known to be a proven warrior already. But otherwise, and he was known to be Catholic. But there was no way of knowing if he would have the same kind of loyalty and commitment to the Holy See that Pepin had. So when he let it be known he didn't really care who the Archbishop of Ravenna turned out to be, then Pope Stephen worried. The usurpation of Ravenna, the Diocese of Ravenna, in the event was only prevented by the local clergy in Ravenna and the people in the city, who knew exactly what Desiderius was and had no desire to see one of his creatures installed as their religious leader. At this moment, when Pope Stephen III felt abandoned and concerned for the future of the Holy See, Desiderius tried another approach. He purchased the services of Paul Aphiarta, who was the papal chamberlain. So he turned. In other words, Desiderius turned. He suborned one of the Pope's men. Aphiarta carefully, but persistently, wheedled on Pope Stephen's fears of a Lombard invasion of Rome and the consequent destruction of the Holy See. He whispers, Charlemagne's, he's not like his father Pepin, Aphiarta said. It's obvious he was not going to cross the Alps to protect the Holy See. So, wouldn't it be better to reach an understanding with Desiderius while the papacy was still free, rather than wait until Desiderius did the deed and captured Rome, and then we have nothing left to bargain with? Would it not be best to make an alliance with Desiderius, even if it meant sacrifice, give him a little territory here and there, in order to achieve the higher purpose of protecting the church? Isn't it worth it? Using these arguments, Desiderius, through his creature, Aphiarta, actually managed to persuade Pope Stephen III to send an ambassador to Pavia to negotiate a papal Lombard alliance. What would have become of that? Well, we won't know, because of the events of the year 771. And for that, we have to catch up with Charlemagne's younger brother, Carloman. The Dowager Queen Bertrada's plan for a Franco-Lombard nexus collapsed in the year 771 and ended up having the opposite effect. She thought it would keep the peace. It ended up being a cause for war. It collapsed because Charlemagne repudiated the Lombard princess Desiderata, sent her back to her father, said, I don't want her, and it's not what whatever. And then he didn't just do that. Then he immediately he took a beautiful Swabian girl named Hildegard as his replacement wife. So the offended princess, Desiderata, returned to her father in Pavia. Now, tribal pride required that the Lombards go to war with the Franks over this to avenge the stain on their honor. Desiderius found a ready ally against Charlemagne in his brother Carloman, who's standing among the, not only he hated Charlemagne anyway, but in addition, Carloman standing among the Franks had plummeted after he abandoned Charles in Aquitaine, but Charles achieved victory anyway. So it was going to be war. But before the brothers met in open battle, Carloman died on December 5th, 771, of a nosebleed, an unstoppable nosebleed. His wife, Carloman's widow, whose name was Gerberga, assumed it was assassination. So she fled with her 2 sons for protection. And where else to go but go to the court of Desiderius? He was Charlemagne's enemy. So this is only one of the causes for, well, actually two of the Desiderata and Gerberga were only 2 of the causes for the antipathy of the Lombards for the Franks, which had never really healed. After what the Lombards regarded as Pepin's betrayal. Remember, they had a prior alliance, the Franks and the Lombards, against the Muslims in Septimania. But then Pepin sided with the Holy See against Aistulf. So the Lombards regarded that as a betrayal. Anyway, the next year, 772, the first raid of Charlemagne against the Saxons occurred. This began 30 years of Franco-Saxon war, which culminated in Charlemagne's conquest of Saxony and its conversion to Christianity. Following all the battles would take us too far outside of church history, so we'll just suffice it to read the summary from a contemporary named Einhard. He was a German Frank, educated at the monastery of Fulda. He served Charlemagne personally as a scholar and an architect, and then after Charlemagne's death, he wrote the first Vita, Caroli Magno, the life of Charles the Great. An excerpt from chapter 7 pertains to the Saxon War. Quote, "No war ever undertaken by the Frank nation was carried on with such persistence and bitterness, or cost so much labor, because the Saxons, like almost all the tribes of Germany, were a fierce people, given to the worship of devils, and hostile to our religion, and did not consider it dishonorable to transgress and violate all law, human and divine. Then there were particular circumstances that tended to cause a breach of peace every day, except in a few places where large forest or mountain ridges intervened and made the bounds certain. The line between ourselves and the Saxons passed almost in its whole extent through open country, so that there was no end to the murders, the thefts, the arsons on both sides. In this way, the Franks became so embittered that they at last resolved to make reprisals no longer, but to come to open war with the Saxons. Accordingly, war was begun against them, and was waged for 33 successive years, with great fury, more, however, to the disadvantage of the Saxons than to the Franks. It could doubtless have been brought to an end sooner, had it not been for the faithlessness of the Saxons. It is hard to say how often they were conquered, and, humbly submitting to the king, promised to do what was enjoined upon them. Without hesitation, the required hostages gave and received the officers sent from the king. They were sometimes so much weakened and reduced that they promised to renounce the worship of devils and to adopt Christianity. But they were no less ready to violate these terms than prompt to accept them. so that it is impossible to tell which came easier to them to do. Scarcely a year passed from the beginning of the war without such changes on their part. But the king did not suffer his high purpose and steadfastness, firm alike in good and evil fortune, to be wearied by any fickleness on their part, or to be turned from the task that he had undertaken. On the contrary, he never allowed their faithless behavior to go unpunished, but either took the field against them in person, or sent his counts with an army to wreak vengeance and exact righteous satisfactions. At last, after conquering and subduing all who had offered resistance, he took 10,000 of those that lived on the banks of the Elbe River, and settled them, with their wives and children, in many different bodies here and there in Gaul and Germany. The war that had lasted so many years was at length ended by their acceding to the terms offered by the king, which were renunciation of their national religious customs and the worship of devils, acceptance of the sacraments of the Christian faith and religion, and union with the Franks to form one people. The Church received the new pope in the same year that Charlemagne began the Saxon Wars, 772. When Pope Stephen III died, the Roman clergy unanimously elected the one man they felt could unite them. His name, well as Pope 95, was Hadrian I. He accepted election on February 1st, 772. He reigned for 23 years and 10 months. The longest papal reign of the medieval period, and the longest reign since St. Peter. And the length of his reign was not surpassed until Pope Pius VI in the 18th century. Hadrian was a graduate of the Lateran School, ordained by Pope Paul I, so he was well known to the Roman clergy. He was the son of a nobleman, so he was acceptable to that group, which had caused so much trouble in setting up Constantine as anti-pope when Paul I died. He was a known believer in the Frankish alliance, so he was able to unite all those factions against the Lombard and Greek factions. Beyond his background, Pope Hadrian was a deeply impressive man. He was articulate, he was learned, he was multilingual, and he just radiated. He just had that presence, he just radiated that. Man of integrity, sanctity, piety, which was desperately needed in this time. He's just one of those guys, just a natural leader. Desiderius, who was still the king of the Lombards, still nursing his grudge against Charlemagne for having repudiated his daughter, and still housing Carloman's widow and her 2 sons, once more sought opportunity against the church at a time of transition. He insisted that the new Pope Hadrian anoint and crown Carloman's 2 sons as rightful heirs to Carloman's lands, which Charlemagne had simply taken when his brother died in 771. So this would have meant half of, well, actually more, because Carloman had more territory, more than half of the Regnum Francorum. And Desiderius, of course, he would charitably sacrifice himself to govern this land on behalf of Carloman's two young sons, until they grew to adulthood, and then of course he would turn it over to them. He was just that kind of guy. Pope Hadrian saw through this, and he flatly refused. So Desiderius then ordered his spy creature in the papal chancery, Paul Afiarda, to persuade the Pope to change his mind, or if that failed, simply kidnap him and bring him as a prisoner to Desiderius in Pavia. Hadrian, having worked in Rome his entire life, had the measure of Afiarda. He knew that he was a spy. He knew that Afiarda had used his position to have the former papal primicerius Christophorus and his son Sergius murdered. And since Hadrian was immensely popular with the people and well connected with the clergy and nobility, it was not long before someone informed him of the plot to kidnap him. He arrested Ephiarta and informed Desiderius that he would never cooperate with him in attacking the Franks. Impatient now with scheming, and convinced that Charlemagne would not bother to invade Italy to protect the papacy as his father had done, Desiderius abandoned scheming in favor of an outright military assault on the papal state in 772. Burning, pillaging, murdering in the countryside, Desiderius then laid siege to the city of Rome. The defense of the city was far more spirited than Desiderius expected, which is indicative of the high morale that is created by a strong leader like Hadrian. Still, Hadrian did not have the military necessary to engage the Lombards in open battle, which is the only tactic that would end the war. Therefore, everything depended on Charlemagne. Up to this point, he was known to be a believer in the Catholic faith, but not of the same mind as his father regarding the independence of the papacy as being essential to that faith. And then something happened. In one of those occurrences, one of those, seeming coincidences, which are probably not coincidences, something happened. At the very time when Desiderius was attacking Rome, Charlemagne was engaged against the Saxons, who were pagan. And, this was his first time fighting pagans. Now, he had fought under his father, but that was against Aquitania and Vasconia, which were already Christian, Catholic, and not even the Visigoths, who were Arian. They were Catholic. So he had combat experience, but he'd never actually been in pagan lands before until this. So this was his first chance to see what paganism really does, how it debases, the humans. And he saw how depraved it was. Specifically, the Saxons worshipped the yew tree as sacred to Odin. And they call these sacred trees Irminsul, the sacred pillar. Charlemagne was horrified to learn that they practiced human sacrifice to trees. Remembering the stories he heard about St. Boniface, Charlemagne had one of these trees he found in Eresburg chopped down in July of 772. It was shortly after this that the papal messengers found him, alerting him to the plight of the Holy See, besieged in Rome by Desiderius. And what I see as the coincidence that really isn't a coincidence is that they arrived after Charlemagne learned that pagans practiced hematomancy, human sacrifice, blood magic, actually murder human beings to sacrifice them to trees because they were pagan, because they believed the tree was got a divinity. Only then did he realize that it finally hit him why his father fought so hard for the church, why his father risked so much for the church, and why the independence of the church was necessary, as he saw what happened without the light of true faith, that people would become toys of the demonic. So the next year, 773, Charlemagne did what his father had done. He crossed the Alps with an army to invade Lombardy. He first defeated Adelchis, who was the son of Desiderius, defeated him at Verona, after which Adelchis escaped to Constantinople, seeking aid from the Byzantine emperor, who was still Copronymus, and still regarded the Exarchate of Ravenna as stolen by Charlemagne's father. Next, Charlemagne attacked Pavia, because it was closer, that's the Lombard capital, which forced Desiderius to abandon the siege of Rome to go back and defend his home turf. During the siege of Pavia, Charlemagne visited Rome in Easter of 774, and he met Pope Hadrian for the first time on April 6th, 774. On that occasion, Hadrian bestowed on Charlemagne the title of Patrician of Rome that had once been awarded to his father Pippin. This visit changed history, this visit to Rome and the meeting. Charlemagne and Hadrian formed a personal bond of friendship and mutual respect, which would make Hadrian's liturgical reforms possible, and I'll discuss that in due course. Charlemagne himself underwent a personal transformation simply by walking through Rome and seeing the grand scale of the surviving structures of ancient Rome. Charlemagne had never seen truly monumental architecture on the scale of the great basilicas in Rome, which had been built by Constantine, given to the church, and they were still there. More importantly, this visual encounter with the engineering achievements of ancient Rome filled Charlemagne with a fascination about the rest, the idea of imperial Rome. With this new perspective, he looked on his many battles against pagan barbarians and the future ones to come in a new way. One that understood that the loss of imperial Rome resulted in chaos and anarchy. So why not fix it? Why not restore imperial Rome? Not the pagan Rome of Caesar and Augustus, nor even the Greek-dominated Byzantine Empire. Instead, Charlemagne dreamed of a Western Europe united politically under his dynasty and united religiously under the Catholic faith. Charlemagne spent the rest of his life fighting to achieve this goal of uniting Western Europe. And it began with the Lombard problem. Depletion of food and water forced Desiderius to ask for terms of surrender in August of 774. Charlemagne required Desiderius to abdicate and retire to a monastery, and he required the other Lombards to accept Charlemagne as Rex Langobardorum, as king of the Lombards, and which means they agreed to submit as a constituent realm of the kingdom of the Franks. And they did. So this ended the independent Lombard kingdom, which had existed for 200 years. Actually, a little longer. Yeah, from 568 to 774. Desiderius did spend the rest of his life at a monastery. His son spent the rest of his life failing to retake his father's kingdom. Many Lombards did accept Charlemagne as Rex, but not all. The Duchy of Friuli in northeastern Italy, as well as the Duchy of Spoleto and the Duchy of Benevento, south of the Papal State, took this opportunity to assert their autonomy. All three duchies would prove to be baneful to the Holy See in the later, as the Middle Ages unfold. The resolution of the Lombard problem, at least for the moment, allowed Hadrian to start the recovery. He expanded and strengthened the fortifications of the city of Rome. To provide a steady supply of fresh drinking water, he rebuilt 4 ancient Roman aqueducts, which had been allowed to fall into disrepair. He reorganized the papal farms, which we saw developed under Pope Zachary, but which had since fallen victim to the Lombard marauders. Pope Hadrian set a goal that each farm would be self-sufficient and be able to produce enough food to feed 100 people a day. In other words, a village, that each village would have a farm and a chapel and a church, and those would be the rural parishes, and each one could support 100 people a day. Amid his other concerns, Pope Hadrian has the distinction of coping with an entirely new Western heresy, an erroneous Christology, generally called adoptionism. Now, this heresy, I call it new, only in the sense that it was put forward in the West for the first time during Hadrian's reign, so it was new to them. However, the erroneous Christology, it asserted, was simply a revival of Nestorianism with a slight twist. Its first proponent in the West was a guy named Elipandus. He was Archbishop of Toledo, Spain. He began teaching that the human Jesus, now this is a heresy, so seminarians don't, be sure to put that in your note. This is wrong, as I'm going to explain. He asserted that the human Jesus was separate from the divine Christ, and that the human Jesus was just an ordinary man. who was adopted by God as the vessel for the divine Christ. So this guy's in Spain at the time. Now, Spain, as we saw previously, was under the political and military control of the Sunni Muslim Umayyad Caliphate of Cordova. The Umayyads were, in general, tolerant of Jews and Christians, allowing them to practice their faith inside their own synagogues and churches if they paid the extra tax. So the location of Elipandos in Umayyad Spain explains the otherwise startling appearance of an ancient Eastern heresy in the 8th century at the opposite end of the Mediterranean Sea. The Muslims employed many Greek and Syrian Christians in the bureaucracy because of their language skills, and they had many more Greeks and Syrians who had converted to Islam. In fact, the Muslim general who had conquered Spain was one. He was a convert to Islam. These Eastern Christians, or just Easterners, brought with them Eastern thought, even if they did become Muslim, which included the Eastern Greek philosophical background that generated so many of these dualistic heresies. So in the Greek East of the day, as we saw, the heresy and sacrilege of iconoclasm was also rooted in Nestorian thinking, which held that an absolute separation between the human Jesus and the divine Christ. That itself can be traced even earlier to ancient Gnostic Manichaean dualism, which believes that matter, the material, is innately evil. So with this background, it's easier to understand how this erroneous Christology entered the discourse in 8th century Spain. Archbishop Elipandos began preaching this, probably not even realizing that it was Nestorian. And because he was in Muslim territory, there was zero that Pope Hadrian could do to stop it. However, the false teaching itself had to be identified and denounced. Even if it could not be stopped, even if you couldn't stop him from preaching it, the faithful would be led astray if this wasn't clarified. So Pope Hadrian wrote a letter to the bishops of Spain explaining Catholic Christology in 785. He wrote another letter to Charlemagne explaining the importance of preventing this error from spreading into France and Germany. The Pope did have the satisfaction of seeing that at least 3 bishops outside of Spain realized the error as they joined in denouncing it as Nestorian at a synod in Frankfurt, presided over by a papal legate in 794. Specifically, the synod explained that if the Nestorian, or if the adoptionist version of Nestorianism is correct, then God had 2 sons, one human and one divine. And that's not in Scripture. Second, it asserted the old maxim of Saint Athanasius: what was not assumed was not redeemed. Christ had to be fully human in order to redeem the fullness of humanity, and he had to be fully divine so that his sacrifice, his one sacrifice, was perfect. And third, if the human Jesus were just adopted by God at the time of his baptism in the Jordan, then he would have been born with original sin, and therefore would not be able to be the perfect sacrifice. He would just be another dude. Okay. This leads us to the 7th Ecumenical Council, the Second Council of Nicaea, and so far the last recognized by both Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox. Because this ended, the Second Council of Nicaea reversed and ended the Byzantine policy of iconoclasm. It happened in this way. The persecuting Byzantine Emperor Constantine V, named by the monks Copronymus, died in 774. His son, Constantine VI, was still a child, so his mother, Irene, served as regent. She was a devout iconodule, meaning venerated images, and even had incurred her husband's abuse, physical abuse, for hiding sacred images in her room to try to save him from destruction. The Patriarch of Constantinople, his name was Paul, abdicated in 784, publicly expressing his remorse for his role in the persecution, which, remember, included blinding people. His successor, Patriarch Teresius, was a devout iconodule. Active persecution stopped as soon as Copronymus died, because the Empress Irene was an iconodule, so she wasn't going to persecute anybody. But she had to move slowly. Remember, iconoclasm was law in the Byzantine Empire, so she had to move slowly, because she's just a regent, for the sun, and iconoclasm had been policy for a while, and there were many Byzantines who really believed it, who really believed it was wrong to represent Mary, saints, Jesus, any with anything material, whether even if it's gold, marble, bronze, wood, that it's actually believed it was wrong. Moreover, there were many implicated in the atrocities committed against iconodules, and they would not welcome the return to favor of relatives that those they had blinded, maimed, murdered. So it was not until September 24th of 787 that the Second Ecumenical Council, the Second Council of Nicaea opened. It was attended by 263 council fathers, including 2 representatives of Pope Hadrian. It met for 8 sessions, produced 22 canons, and a dogmatic definition. To summarize its teaching, it just basically appropriated St. John Damascene's writings. He was deceased by now, but his writings were known. So it appropriated his distinction. That stuff keeps popping up. So it appropriated his distinction between latria, which is worship, that is reserved for God alone, as distinct from dulia, which means respect, and that's a degree of honor that we give to angels and saints. Not worship. We don't consider them divine, but we do give them that honor. Whereas hyperdulia is in between. That's a higher form of respect given to Our Lady alone. And this is in the Catechism, number 2132, which summarizes the mind of the Church with regard to venerating images, and that refers to this council, Nicaea II. Quote, "We therefore, following the royal pathway and the divinely inspired authority of the Holy Fathers and the traditions of the Church, for as we all know, the Holy Spirit dwells within her, define with all certitude and accuracy that just as the figure of the precious and life-giving cross, so also the venerable and holy images, as well in painting and mosaic as of other fit material, should be set forth in the holy churches of God, and on the sacred vessels, and on the vestments, and on hangings, and in pictures, both in houses and by the wayside. That is, the figure of our Lord God and Savior, Jesus Christ, of our spotless Lady, the Mother of God, of the honorable angels, and of all saints, and all pious people. For so much more frequently as they are seen in artistic representation, so much more readily are men lifted up to the memory of their prototypes, and to a longing after them. And to these should be given due salutation and honorable reverence. Not, indeed, that true worship of faith which pertains alone to the divinity, but to these as to the figure of the precious and life-giving cross, and to the book of the Gospels, and to other holy objects, incense and lights may be offered according to ancient pious custom. For the honor which is paid to the image passes on to that which the image represents. And he who reveres the image reveres in it the subject represented. Okay, that is the teaching of the church. Which brings us to Pope Hadrian's liturgical reforms. Now, this is, of course, on church history, designed for seminarians. So for those of you others who are watching it on YouTube, parishioners, if it gets to be too technical with the liturgy and all, I'm sorry, but, this is for seminarians. But hopefully you'll find it interesting. So Hadrian's reforms are very comprehensive, dealt with the Mass, with devotions, with the liturgy of the hours, sacred art, architecture, sacred architecture. So you might find this interesting. Okay, so liturgical reforms. The most long-lasting of Pope Hadrian's initiatives was in this area of liturgy. His reforms set the style and the mode of Catholic worship in the Middle Ages. So after all this chaos, the barbarians, the successor kingdoms, everything's ripped apart. But now, you see, as we've covered through the Merovingians and Carolingians, despite all the war, the church has made real progress in converting these successor kingdoms. The Ireland, Scotland, England, Wales, France, Phrygia, the Netherlands, Belgium, at least parts of Germany, southern Germany and western Germany, Italy. So the church has made real progress, and so now now we can do this. We, see that of course the rituals are going to have been affected because the training got disrupted. So this is part of Hadrian's service to the church. The key problem was maintaining accurate ritual books. The Missal for the Mass and other prayer books for the other sacraments and devotions. We kind of alluded to this in St. Boniface. One of the things he did is he brought with him the Roman Book of Sacraments. He used that as the norm. And that's the Missal he used is we don't have one that he actually touched, but the edition, in other words, he used survives as the Verona Sacramentary. And I talked about that in the section on St. Boniface. Because of the necessity of copying books by hand, when one began to wear out, that Verona Sacramentary, which is based on Pope Leo the Great's, became victim to accretions. It's the scribal problem, the copyist problem. So in the case of Hadrian, so like dealing with France, because, future France. So they have an old missal. Okay, so the abbot says, okay, this is wearing out. While it can still be read, so you guys make another copy of it. So they're looking at it, and the scribe goes, well, what exactly is that letter? Oh, I don't know. Well, that letter could change the word. Well, I don't know, what word is that? Well, I'm not sure, but I got to put something, so put something down. It might be a different word. Then going through, copying something else, so, well, we get to this, but we do something, an additional thing here that's skipped in this missal. Well, I'm just going to add that in there, because we add this prayer here. We do that. And then, could just kind of nod and skip a line and not even realize it, or skip two lines. Or just, try to remember a line and then write, but then get a few words wrong. So it's all these scribal problems. Not malice, it's just, it's human. And remember, there's no electricity. These guys are doing this by hand, with the candlelight. So that's the scribal problem. And and this happened, and so that when that book wears out, then the next people, the next guy's copying, well, all those additions, they think that they're going to read that and put those additions in, thinking that they were in the original sacramentary of Pope Leo, when it's not. But yet even they may, well, okay, by the time they get to, we do this, so we're going to add this in there too. So you have that generation after generation with all these local adaptations. Pope Hadrian, with all thinking bishops, he was aware of this problem and the damage it caused, but they had no real solution because standardization would not be possible until the printing press, where you can just have one edition that could just be mass produced. So what do? But Hadrian's reforms, as distinct from the attempted reforms of previous popes trying to correct this problem, can be traced to the advantages presented by Charlemagne. Gotta tell you, year 2020. Like a theme park for Satan. Okay. Where was I? So this brings us to the issue of Gallicanism. Remember the old, what's now France, and the Roman and the imperial maps, it was the province of Gaul. So distinct liturgical practices, spiritual practices that that developed in that region were collectively called Gallican or Gallicanism, the Gallican liturgy, Gallican Mass. And they developed in the way I described, that the text problem, with these local accretions. Now, Pope Hadrian, when he gets to do the reform, he does not simply order that all these accretions be deleted. He has his scholars study, and I'm going to get to how he has access to so many scholars, but he has his scholars study those accretions. And if those additions did not contradict the faith, then he allowed them to be included in the Book of the Sacraments. So these are some elements that we take for granted, that are so much part of our liturgy, but they can be traced back to here. Further, Pope Hadrian's reform occurred at a time when Charlemagne was conducting a vast upgrade of education in his realm. And I'll discuss the details of that too in due course. But its importance for the liturgical reform is that with the many copies of a first correct edition of Hadrian's Sacramentary, they could all be cut. Like, he had enough scholars, and Charlemagne had united enough to where dozens and dozens of cathedrals and monasteries could get copies made in the same scriptorium from the same original. So it's not quite the printing press, but they could actually do a reset. All these places could get virtually at the same time. They could be mailed out from Rome and sent by messenger, and they get it virtually at the same time. A new corrected sacramentary, a missal. This Reform Missal, Hadrian's Missal, was in two sections. The first part was the Roman section, of what we would think of as the ordinary of the Mass, the part that doesn't change. The second was a supplement of approved Gallican practices. This brought clarity and order to the previous pattern of, just monk copyists just adding in stuff, but by having them separate, then it was clear you have the ordinary, then you have permitted options. So that's the origin of the propers. So you have, the first part, the Roman section was the ordinary of the Mass, whereas the permitted variations are the propers, seasonal propers, saints' days, that kind of thing. But they still fit within the ordinary. So the ordinary is the outline that doesn't change, and then these permitted variations fit within that. Okay, so with the Mass, Hadrian blended the Roman and the Gallican in a way that is more familiar to us if we had a time machine and went back and sat through the Mass than it would have been if we got on the time machine and went back a century earlier. Because it has remained standard practice in the Latin Rite ever since. So the distinction, the ordinary of the Mass, the opening prayer, the readings, homily, the canon, which is the Eucharistic prayer, the Lord's Prayer, communion. Adhering to this basic outline was not something that the Gallicans had done. Instead, the Gallicans, like almost every day, was something different, something new, kind of tailored for the day and the season. So the Hadrian solution to that was the alternate prayers for the seasons, the saints' days, prayers for the dead, votive masses, particular Frankish saints, special blessings for things like animals, crops, new homes, and more substantially, Pope Hadrian allowed the incorporation of the Gallican practice of special octaves of masses. So the eight Beatitudes, so there'd be 8 masses, 8 days attached to special feasts. Initially, for the Gallicans, it was Epiphany, Easter, and Pentecost. Apart from this, the most striking change that resulted from this blending was regarding Lent and Holy Week. We've already seen in the previous reign how the Gallican rite, well, I hate that this not, but Gallican practice had its origin in the Greek East with Antioch, the Liturgy of Antioch, because it was missionaries, like St. Paul, was sponsored by Antioch. So it was missionaries sponsored by Antioch from the East that were missionaries to the West. And so it was Greek missionaries who first evangelized Roman Gaul when it was still under the empire. St. Pothinus, St. Irenaeus, those guys they were Greeks. They were from the East, and they brought that liturgy with them. That being the case, the Gallican practice retained elaborate rituals for Lent and Easter. Pope Hadrian allowed these to be incorporated. They included a special ritual for the blessing and distribution of ashes, blessing of palms, a procession for Palm Sunday, reading of both the Palm Sunday and the Passion Gospels on the Sunday before Easter. It included Tenebrae, the ritual of Tenebrae, on the Wednesday of Holy Week. That was the day that Judas made his deal to betray Jesus. The actual deed was done later, but the intent, so that's when the decision to betray and the acceptance of the money, that happened on Wednesday of Holy Week. And so Tenebrae is the darkness, is the darkest deed in human history. Special blessing and asperges, sprinkle. Asperges means sprinkling. So the rite of sprinkling with the holy water on Easter. It's important to understand that Pope Hadrian did not invent any of this. He simply exercised his authority as teacher, as the magisterium, to approve the blending of disparate liturgical traditions in a way he saw that would not contradict the faith, would not contradict dogma, and yet was still able to bring fitting worship to God and proper celebration of the sacraments. Regarding the divine office, the Liturgy of the Hours, the Breviary, Pope Hadrian included this in his liturgical reforms, following the same principle which guided the reforms of the Mass. Hadrian allowed a blending of Roman and Gallican practice. The result of this blending was collected in what was for the first time called a breviary. That is from the Latin breviarium, which means an abridgment. And this was done by Alcuin of York, an immensely important scholar of the Carolingian period, whom we'll get to in due course. Now, the divine office itself, of course, like the Mass, was not invented by Pope Hadrian. For you seminarians, you may remember from the patristics course, we saw the reign of Pope Stephen the First, the practice of sanctifying the day by offering formal prayers Dated initially, it was just the Our Father 3 times a day. And then later, the monastic practice codified this, but of course added more prayers than that, using the Psalms. And then the monasticism spread. And then, so that divine office was subject to the same bifurcation that occurred, with the copying problem and the local variation problem. The basic outline of the Roman divine office was that a convent, monastery, cathedral chapter would pray every 3 hours. They would stop and pray. Public, well, not all, because some were cloistered, but some they'd be open to the public, would do this in public in the monastery or convent, and that became possible after legalization of Christianity. So this would be matins, which is done at night, and that's divided into 3 nocturnes corresponding to the 3 watches of the night. That's 9 p.m., midnight, 3 a.m. Lauds at dawn. Prime, the first hour. That's the old imperial clock, so the first hour of the day was considered to be 6 a.m. Terce, the 3rd hour, which was 9 a.m. Sext, S-E-X-T, the 6th hour at noon. None, the 9th hour, 3 p.m. And Vespers at dusk. Then Compline, which is before, completorium means completion, so it was the one done before retiring for the night. Public recitation of these hours became possible after legalization. All but 2 of those were practiced at the time, with Prime and Compline being added later by St. Benedict, who built on existing Roman practice and tailored it for use in his interpretation, his structure of Pachomian monasticism. Roman practice between St. Benedict and Pope Hadrian was that 12 psalms would be recited during the day and 6 recited during the night, distributed throughout the hours, the 8 canonical hours. The psalms prior to Pope Hadrian were simply recited in order, the 150 psalms, just in the order of St. Jerome's Vulgate, until the entire Psalter was completed, and then the cycle would start over again. But Gallican practice combined the nocturnes, the lauds, and matins into one prayer period, thereby losing the monastic ideal of praying every 3 hours. More serious, on the major feast days, they would dispense with the psalm altogether and instead have extended readings from the writings of the saints, if it was a saint's day, or writing about those saints, or, like by the church fathers. When the psalms were recited, in Gallican practice, they were done in thematic groupings rather than sequentially. Pope Hadrian's solution to this problem was the same as what he did with the Mass. He allowed a deliberate blending, not just random blending, just, what you want to do, but a deliberate blending of Roman practice with Gallican practice. So from the Roman practice, it'd be the basic structure, would not change. But from the Gallican practice, variations, optional variations were permitted for saints' days, feast days, seasons, as long as they did not contradict the faith or, be detrimental to church order. He had them collected together in a work called the Breviary, the Breviarium, the abridgment, and then had that work copied and recopied hundreds of times, sent to all the abbeys and cathedrals that he had access to in Western Europe. Then those provided templates for more copying, so yet another reset. The liturgical year. Like the Mass and the Divine Office, the Church has a well-developed liturgical calendar and had that prior to Pope Hadrian. But it, too, had fallen into chaotic local practices, just as had the rest of Western liturgical life because of the confusion. Pope Hadrian continues following the same principles as guided the rest, consciously blended the two traditions. So not conceding to everyone just the option to just do what you want as long as you're praying, but instead did the Roman practice is always the structure. But within that structure, some permitted, already vetted, options would be allowed as long as they've been ascertained to not contradict the faith. But that doesn't mean, just because they might offer 4 options for something, that doesn't mean someone could just say, well, okay, they allow those 4 options, so I can make up some options too. No. Then you go back to the Roman, that the basic structure doesn't change. Okay. With the liturgical calendar, as Hadrian re-envisioned it, everything centered around Easter. Now, of course, he didn't invent that either. I shouldn't say that. I mean, Easter was but he added some things around Easter to re-emphasize its centrality, which included preparation. So there's Lent, the Quadragesima, the 40 days. Now, a period of preparation before Easter, that also dates. That's from Pope Telesphorus. So that although initially it wasn't 40 days, but it kind of grew. So that also dates from antiquity. But then he started adding. So to the Quadragesima, to the 40 days, Pope Hadrian added the Quinquagesima, the 50 days. That would begin the Sunday before Ash Wednesday. So fasting began that evening, and confession would be sought as a preparation for receiving ashes in a spirit of penitence on Ash Wednesday. So it start the Sunday before Ash Wednesday. Then you receive, and I'm going to get to that, how that's different from the way so is the Sunday before. This 50 days before Easter was a mirror of the 50 days following Easter that culminates with Pentecost. So 50 days before Easter, 50 days after. But that's not all. 2 Sundays before Lent, that would be the 8th Sunday before Easter, was called the Sexagesima, the 60 days. On that Sunday, Luke chapter 8 would be read. That's the gospel of the seed falling on the different soils. This was intended as spiritual preparation for Quinquagesima Sunday, the next Sunday, which began the preparation for Ash Wednesday. And Ash Wednesday began the preparation for Easter. Going back even further, 3 Sundays before Lent was called Septuagesima, 70 days. On that Sunday, Luke chapter 15 would be read as the gospel. That's the prodigal son. This was a spiritual preparation looking at one's own sinfulness in order to better reflect on the gospel of the next week, the sower, because then you're in a more spiritual position to know which soil you are. Are you the rocky soil, the thorny soil, the shallow soil, or the rich soil? And that would be ideal preparation for the Sunday following, prior to the beginning of Lent, which is confession. That's when you prepare for confession. Now, there are interesting elements with this liturgical view. One is very revealing of the medieval mentality, is the difference in how it regarded Lent as opposed to how we regard Lent. So today, Lent, we think is a season of penance, and of course it always was. But we think of it more as personal penance. And in many parishes, they'll have a parish mission, they'll have confessions like halfway through Lent. But to the medieval mind, and I'm not saying that's wrong. I mean, the church, just as Pope Hadrian, subsequently the church can reorder these practices. But in the medieval mind, one did not use Lent as a time for personal penance. Lent was a time for the church to prepare for Easter. So the church was undergoing penance, penitential, with the fasting, the ashes, and the readings, and meditation. But because Lent was so important to the medieval mind, one had to prepare for Lent. So Lent was seen as having spiritual value in itself, not just as a preparation for Easter. So you had to prepare for Lent. So that they went to confession before Lent. So like if for them and for the medieval mind, if you waited until Lent to go to confession, you've already blown it. Like you wasted that time. Instead, the spiritual preparation starts 3 Sundays before with these Gospels, so that the Sunday before, that evening is when confession started. So it would be that Sunday, then Monday and Tuesday, culminating Shrove Tuesday, like that with Mardi Gras, it's been paganized now. But that religiously to the medieval mind, that would be the last point, where you would have confession in order to be ready for Lent. Okay, that's just just a very brief, summary of the reforms. Okay, one example of how these reforms were spread takes us to another saint, the life of Saint Ludger, Ludger. He is the apostle of Saxony. Ludger was a spiritual grandson, so to speak, of Saint Willibrord, as he was born into a ethnically Frisian Catholic family. At age 11, Ludger saw St. Boniface on what turned out to be Boniface's final mission going up to northern Frisia. And he was inspired, and he decided, like Gregory of Utrecht, who we met earlier, he was inspired by Boniface to pursue an ecclesiastical life. So he was in the first group, Ludger was in the first group of students to enroll in the Utrecht Cathedral School when it was founded by St. Gregory of Utrecht 3 years later. When it was 11 years later, in 767, Ludger spent a year in York, England, studying under Alcuin of York, forming a lifelong friendship. And Alcuin was a student of a man who had been a student of St. Bede, the Venerable. Then, after the year, Ludger returned to Utrecht. When the bishop, St. Gregory, died in 775, Ludger wrote his Vita, wrote his biography, and I used that earlier in the course. 2 years after that, on July 7th, 777, Ludger was ordained a priest and assigned to Cologne, Germany, to serve existing Catholics, but with the long-term objective of leading missionaries into Saxony. This was 5 years after Charlemagne's wars in Saxony commenced. Okay, so all right. Okay, so here is Cologne, Germany. All right, so you see Belgium, France, the Netherlands, see where Utrecht, and so there's Cologne. So it's just right over the border, and so it's going to be used as a base. And so the Saxony, where the wars are fought, Cologne is going to be used as a base for this. So Saxony is the next part of, they already has Swabia, Bavaria, Alemannia. So now they're going to move into Saxony, and Cologne is the base. So Ludger was ordained there at Cologne, and with the understanding that he was supposed to be one of those developing, the plan for and to go do the work, to go evangelize the Saxons. A decade later, in 767, St. Ludger was appointed by Pope Hadrian officially as missionary to the districts east of the river Lauwers, which was the border in the Netherlands. Well, currently it's in the Netherlands, and at the time it was the border between the Regnum Francorum and the pagans to the east. So Charlemagne's success in battle extended the border politically to the east, and so now the Pope assigns St. Ludger to extend the border ecclesially in the east by converting, or leading, it wasn't doing it alone, of course, but leading the expedition to convert the pagans. 98 miles northeast of Cologne, St. Ludger established a base at Munster in Germany. That's now in the German state of the North Rhine-Westphalia. Here at Munster, Ludger lived with his monks according to the rule of St. Chrodegang of Metz, which in 789 was made obligatory in Frankish territories for priests living in community who were not monks. Monks had to use the rule of St. Benedict. And he built churches. I won't go through all of it. He built churches. He built the first convent for women in Westphalia. His sister was the Gerberga was the first abbess. He built a abbey himself at Verden, and then that became the nucleus for building up the church in Munster. And then he succeeded, and on March 30th, 805, he was ordained as founding bishop of Munster. He died at his post and in 809. His feast day is March 26th. He is honored as the Apostle of Saxony. He is the patron saint of Groningen and Deventer in the Netherlands. And he's the patron saint of the Diocese of Munster, of course, because he founded it, and the city of Verden, which built up around the Abbey of Verden. 2 years after St. Ludger first went to Cologne, which takes us back to 779, we find another important initiative, this time in medieval monasticism, introducing us to St. Benedict of Aniane, A-N-I-A-N-E. As in general, as we've seen, the papacy saw the rule of St. Benedict correctly as a solid basis for monastic life, a Pachomian monastic life, communal monasticism. Yet monasticism itself had been the subject of the same chaotic forces described above, with the collapse of the empire, the successive kingdoms, the endless barbarian wars, disruption of education, loss of literacy, etc. The result is that there were many monasteries claiming to be following the rule, but were not. Now, those fell into two categories. There were some who genuinely believed they were following the rule, but the text of the rule they had been so changed over the generations that they really didn't know, but that they had actually deviated a great deal from it, but they were sincere. Now, there's another category which falls into the feudalism problem, which I've already talked about, where these people were sent into monastic life by their family without a real vocation, and then just didn't care. Whether they had an accurate copy of the rule or not, they just didn't care. And they weren't bothering to live it at all. Pope Hadrian recruited a man to spearhead a investigation and reform of monasteries along the lines of the original Benedict. Now, this guy did not have to write a rule, because Hadrian was not going to change the rule of Benedict, because it was proven to be successful, but instead investigate, to see, do these people have an accurate copy? If they don't, to get it to them. And if they are sincere, which means they have the humility to understand, are they going to adjust and make the changes? Or is it the feudalism problem, and these people just don't care? And in that case, can they forcibly reform it? And that's where the relationship with Charlemagne helped, because then he had actual power he could call on. And if they didn't want to do it, well, just close the monastery. Now it's harder with the feudalism thing, because these monasteries were endowed with land, and those families had a vested commercial interest, which of course was the whole basis of the problem. So it wouldn't be all that easy. But he recognized the problem, and this was an attempt to fix it. So the man he appointed to undertake it, coincidentally, was also named Benedict, St. Benedict of Aniane. This guy was of German extraction, but born in southern France. His baptismal name was Vitaiza. Vitzaya, Witzia, Witzia. His father was a count in the Carolingian service. Originally, Witzia trained as a soldier. He fought in the army under Pepin the Short and under Charlemagne. It was while with the army, when Charlemagne finally destroyed the kingdom of Desiderius, that Witzia encountered Benedictine monasticism at Monte Cassino in Italy. He then resolved to dedicate the rest of his life to this ideal. He became a monk, taking the name of Benedict. After several years in the monastery, he returned to his family estates at Aniani in southern France in 779, and he established a monastery there for the strict observance of the Benedictine rule. His efforts attracted many to his foundation, which brought him to the attention of Pope Hadrian and Charlemagne. The goal of his reform is twofold. First, to impose the rule of St. Benedict on those monasteries which had no rule. Second, to ensure those monasteries already claiming to follow it in fact were. These and other parallel efforts drew momentum in the whole project intentionally to reset things in the West, drew momentum from the attitudes of Charlemagne and his own personal commitment to promote education, culture, and faith under the aegis of his imperial vision of political unity and religious unity. And remember, the separation of church and state, that idea, that's a caprice of the 18th century. That's something that would not have occurred to the medieval mind, any more than it would have to the ancient Romans. So this whole movement, subsequent historians have called it the Carolingian Renaissance. The word Renaissance means rebirth, and it is a term that is applied to the movement of secular humanism beginning in the 1300s in Italy. Yet, because this movement, the Carolingian movement, included many advances in art, architecture, sculpture, literature, music, education, religion, medieval historians have used the term Renaissance for this period, even though it had absolutely nothing to do with secular humanism. In fact, it was the antithesis of it. So that's why it's called the Carolingian Renaissance, to distinguish it from the Italian Renaissance. A constituent element was schools, is education. And this brings us back, early on, we had many, Bede and Cassiodorus, Isidore, this idea of, perpetuating learning and education. Now, Charlemagne, personally, was a very intelligent man. He was fluent in 5 languages, and he could understand 3 others. Yet, he never learned to write. His education was that of a warrior. Yet, he did value the life of the mind, and he surrounded himself with men who were literate and educated. He resolved that part of his new imperial vision of a united Christian Europe, or Christendom, as we say, would be a new standard of education. The most important man he recruited to implement this is one we've alluded to a few times, and now we get to meet him in his context, Alcuin of York. Alcuin. His life dates 735 to 804. He was born in northern England. He grew up in the environment of devout scholarship, which produced St. Bede. And as I mentioned, when Alcuin attended the cathedral school of St. Peter's in York, his teacher was Egbert, and Egbert had been a pupil of St. Bede. Alcuin showed a facility for language and scholarship from childhood. He was recruited later to teach in the cathedral school when his own education was completed. So like his alma mater, they recruited him to come back. And he actually took over that school in 767 as the scholarch. Alcuin advanced through the holy orders, became a deacon, but in the end, he refused ordination as a priest for decades because he feared that it would take him away from the life of scholarship, which was his true love. He was the kind of teacher that students remember for the rest of their lives. He combined a magnetic personality with an analytical mind, a natural affinity for order and clarity that enabled the students to learn and grow in a steady, coherent way. After they left, they wrote to him. I mean, so they didn't just submit while he was a scholarch. It was a personal thing. You know, he wrote to them, they wrote to him, and they all had Latin nicknames for each other that they had given him in school. So if you ever read his correspondence, it'd be confusing because they talk about an Albinus. They go, well, who is this? Well, that's him. That was his nickname. Albus means white, so white hair. He had prematurely white hair, so that was their nickname for him. Young men who studied under Alcuin in York and later in France later fill the highest offices. Among the number of Alcuin students, the bishops of Sens, Utrecht, Cologne, Constance, Metz, Friesing, as well as the abbots of Corbière, Fleury, Fulda. And in addition, there were those who never took holy orders. There were those who were the sons of Carolingian nobility, who the family sent just to get educated, but you never intended them to enter the church. And this included Charlemagne's own children. He wanted them to be educated too, to know how to read and write, because he always felt that loss, that he never learned to write. And countless other priests and scribes whose names have been lost, but who nevertheless filled the offices and the service of the nobility, both secular and ecclesiastic, of Europe. So, like Pope Hadrian, Alcuin did not invent the reforms of education that are attached to his name. What he did was research the educational methods of the past, and he brought them together, synthesized them into a system that was workable in a medieval context and useful for Charlemagne's imperial design. Because of the prestige attached to Alcuin's name, his method was copied and became the basis of subsequent medieval education. Synthesizing development, the trivium, the quadrivium, from Cassiodorus, and added to Isidore's, that idea combining, Isidore combined that Cassiodorus's ideal of an ascetic scholar with the Benedictine ideal of work and prayer, and then St. Chrodegon. Alcuin researched all of that, synthesized that, and within this context. In keeping central to the school was the scriptorium, the place where young men not only learned to write, but where older manuscripts were copied and recopied and preserved. This institution in Benedictine monasteries, which survived when medieval schools did not, preserved much of our classical Western heritage, which otherwise would have been lost. In keeping with his nature, with his analytical, orderly mind, and to avoid, couldn't completely avoid it, but at least to minimize the problem, the scribal problem, manuscript copying, Alcuin schools developed a standard form of handwriting, which came to be known as Carolingian minuscule. It was a clear, printed form of letters with uniform spacing, and the papers would be placed on a wooden template, so that each page would have the same margins and would have the same spacing between lines. In terms of architecture, the Carolingian Renaissance produced its own style of architecture, which survives most prominently in churches of the early medieval period. Since Charlemagne was inspired by Rome, this style of architecture was also inspired by Rome, by the surviving examples of Rome. So but they're not identical. I mean, they're obviously not from antiquity. but they do have some elements. And so they are called Roman-like or Romanesque. So Romanesque architecture is the Carolingian form, but inspired by antiquity. Central to the ancient Roman architecture and engineering was the arch, the Roman arch, which is the rounded arch. And the Romans invented that. You know, we kind of take that for granted, but like even the ancient Greeks did not have the arch. If you look at the Parthenon and all the stuff in Athens, as impressive as those buildings, it's post and lintel construction. So you have the two upright posts and then over the top. So they did not have the arch. Even the Egyptians who built the pyramids did not have the arch. If you exit inside the pyramids, they had the corbelled vaults. So it's like you'd have a layer of bricks if you have an open space. So the wall, you have a layer of bricks here. Then the next layer would be push a little further over. Next layer a little further over. Next one, go like this until it comes up to a point to open up a space. But that's not really an arch. The Romans developed the rounded arch, which is a true load-bearing arch. So Romanesque has the rounded arch, which is distinct from the next, which we'll get to later in the medieval period, the Gothic, which is the French arch, and that's the pointed arch. But some developments in engineering had to happen before that could occur. Okay. For the Romanesque churches, since they wanted to make them huge, the rounded arch had to be supported by huge columns, and they wanted the long aisle, and so you have these rows and rows of columns supporting a series of rounded arches. So it creates a vault of these rounded arches. The width of these vaults, in other words, the width of the aisles then, were limited by the rounded arch at the top, because the rounded arch really was load-bearing. It was really supporting the weight of the roof. And that problem would not be overcome until the Gothic, the French arch, which we'll get to later. Sacred art within the Romanesque churches, where the statues were very long and narrow, and so they're imitating Byzantine icons, which were like that, very stylized, very formal, narrow. So they like mounted them on the pillars, so they fit there. Now, why? Why do they use that? Because the examples of Roman statues that they had, ancient imperial Roman statues they had, were pagan, and many of them were nude statues, and that was repugnant to medieval religious sensibilities. So, I mean, we're not going to have a nude statue of Our Lady, and so, but so then you have the fully. They're long and narrow, and the fully draped, so they're covered from the neck to the ankles, long sleeves, and so the bodies are really almost identical. So you just have the head that is sometimes distinct with the halo behind, and sometimes they'll be holding something different. St. Peter will be holding keys, St. Paul the sword, some may be holding a church, Our Lady will be holding the baby Jesus. All right, so these are just a few elements of the cultural aspects of the Carolingian Renaissance, promoted by Pope Hadrian in cooperation with Charlemagne. Well, Pope Hadrian died on Christmas Day, 795, after a reign of 23 years and 10 months. Charlemagne lived another 19 years, so we're going to see him again. After Pope Hadrian was buried, a priest stationed at Santa Susanna in Rome was elected to replace him as Pope 96. This is Saint Leo III. Orphaned as a child, Leo was brought up in the papal school attached to the Lateran, so naturally entered papal service upon completion of his studies and ordination to the priesthood. Leo was well known as an administrator, having served for years as treasurer of Pope Hadrian's household, that's the Vestiarius. He reigned for 21 years. The one flaw in his background, in the eyes of the worldly at the time, was that his family of origin was of almost the lowest class. It was said that his parents were sharecroppers, which means serfs, and even more unforgivable, less forgivable, his grandparents had been slaves. Following Pope Hadrian, who, though he also was an orphan, was nevertheless an aristocrat, this accident of birth rendered Leo unacceptable to many in the lay aristocracy of Rome. This caused a reigniting of the factionalism which had, if not disappeared, at least became quiescent under Pope Hadrian's strong leadership. Pope Leo III was a believer in the Frankish alliance as necessary to maintain the independence of the Holy See. And he had the support of many of the Roman clergy with whom he had worked his whole life. Yet the Italian nobility turned on him. And with them, Leo lost the support of some of the Roman clergy. As often, they were related. I mean, some of they were younger sons of these families, so they just followed the lead of their family for reasons of personal safety, which in the 8th century, that's a consideration. Those who had been partisans of the Lombard kingdom were now without patrons because Charlemagne eliminated its independence. So they switched their allegiance to one of the other factions, according to whichever would give them the most personal or familial advantage: the Roman clergy, the Franks, and the Greeks. On April 25th, 799, Pope Leo III was in a procession honoring St. Mark the Evangelist. This was an annual event, public event, well known. So his enemies had plenty of time to prepare. When the procession passed in front of St. Sylvester's church, a gang of thugs, whom subsequent events proved to have been employed by Italian nobles, ambushed Pope Leo. They wished to render him incapable of fulfilling the papal office. So they ripped out his tongue and gouged out his eyes. In the days before Braille, this meant that he would not be able to say Mass or pronounce any blessings. They then imprisoned him in a monastery of the martyr St. Erasmus, which is St. Elmo, by the way, on the Carolingian hill in Rome. Meanwhile, the Italian nobles who paid these thugs announced that the Pope had been shamefully attacked by random bandits who, alas, they escaped. We'd have no idea who they are. And the poor Pope, he was mutilated, he's just not capable of fulfilling the papal office. So that means we don't have a Pope. The next step would have been for them to proclaim an anti-pope. And this person would have been an anti-pope, not a real pope, because physical incapacity does not mean that a validly elected pope is no longer pope. It simply means that he has to delegate some of his functions to others. Or abdicate. I mean, he could choose to abdicate, but he does not. Just because he's physically incapable doesn't mean he stops being pope. The conspirators were not able to proceed with their plan because Pope Leo received a miraculous healing. That's why he's Saint Leo III. This healing so impressed the monks in the monastery where he was imprisoned that they not only released him, but that they saw to it that he escaped the city and made his way across the Alps to find Charlemagne. Pope Leo found him at Paderborn in Westphalia. That's the Upper Rhine region of Germany. Seriously worried now that their planned coup had miscarried, the Italian nobles in on the conspiracy rushed to Charlemagne themselves in order to discredit the Pope. And the discrediting is as usual, farrago they accused him of adultery. Of course, no evidence is, that's it's not necessary, but And they inadvertently, in accusing him of adultery, which is, violating a commandment, they then inadvertently revived the Donatist heresy from antiquity in arguing that the act of adultery, since it broke a commandment, was de facto a mortal sin, and that the mortal sin rendered Leo automatically deposed as pope, because an immoral cleric cannot validly officiate at the sacraments. That's their reasoning, which of course is erroneous. Donatism was condemned. And the reasoning is absurd, because the only two sinless people ever were Jesus and Mary. So that reasoning would render sacramental life impossible. But regardless, the accusers demanded that Pope Leo stand trial on the charges of adultery. Charlemagne, for all of his many talents, was no theologian. And being born into royalty, he had a personal distaste for men of the serving class, which is the class that Leo was born into. When Charlemagne was dealing with the previous Pope, Hadrian I, he knew that he was facing a cultivated aristocrat, somebody in the club, the elite Masters of the Universe Club. Whereas to converse with a lower class person in any way other than giving orders was considered by many nobles to be demeaning, especially if that lower class person had a position like the Pope, which demanded that the noble actually be respectful to her. This attitude was responsible for the sacrilegious attack on Leo, and it very nearly resulted in Charlemagne agreeing to have him stand trial, based on a Donatist heretical theology. It was only the fortuitous presence of Alcuin of York, the famous teacher, which prevented that from happening. Charlemagne had such respect for Alcuin's intelligence, his learning, and his piety that he asked him, he asked his advice on this theological issue. And Alcuin told him the theology that no earthly power can sit in judgment of the Holy See, and that it was irrelevant anyway, because even if he were guilty of what he was accused of, that would not invalidate his sacraments or his election as Pope. Now, it's a measure of how much Charlemagne trusted Alcuin in these matters that ended it, as far as he was concerned. These guys demanding Leo's trial. He said, well, no, Alcuin says it's not correct, so it's not correct. So get over it. We're not doing it. So Charlemagne had Leo return to Rome under the protection of Frankish troops in November of 799. He had the conspirators put on trial for their crimes. They were convicted, of course, but instead of being put to death, which would have been the penalty if they had done that to, say a Carolingian noble, they were merely exiled. And this, too, is an indication of the prejudice of the upper class against the lower, that Charlemagne could not bring himself to execute aristocrats for attacking a commoner, even if the commoner was a pope. This left Leo with the problem that many in Rome still did not support him, most especially the relatives of those nobles who were exiled for having conspired against him. So after a year of dealing with the discontent, the Pope made an attempt to assuage those who continued to repeat the lie that he had committed adultery. He held a solemn high mass in St. Peter's Basilica on December 23rd, 800, during which he stood in front of the tomb of the first apostle and took a solemn oath before God, called an oath of purgation, avowing his innocence. Those who truly despised him would never accept anything less than his removal. But this act was acceptable to most moderates in the city, who, after all, did not want another civil war. More importantly, the clergy of the city, apart from a few who were younger sons of the nobility implicated, remained steadfast in their support of Leo, which they passed on to their people. The monks of the city also supported Leo, and were avid in spreading the story of his miraculous healing as evidence of God's favor. Quite the contrary of the accusation of these people that he was in mortal sin. 2 days after this oath of purgation, bringing us to Christmas Day in the year 800, Charlemagne attended Mass for Christmas at St. Peter's Basilica. There, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as the first Holy Roman Emperor, thereby bringing to fruition Charlemagne's imperial dream, which was born during that visit to Rome we talked about earlier, 27 years earlier. This Holy Roman Empire existed for 1,006 years until Napoleon ended it in 1806. This move by the Pope of creating a Holy Roman Emperor antagonized the Byzantine Empire only a few years after good relations had been restored with the suppression of the iconoclast heresy at the Second Council of Nicaea, which was in 787. Pope Leo thought he had the perfect solution to the problem. The East, as we saw, was ruled by the first empress in Byzantine history, the Empress Irene, whose devotion to sacred images had enabled the iconoclast heresy to finally be put down. So Leo thought, why not unite East and West through marriage? Pope Leo pursued that policy, but when the Empress Irene was overthrown in 802, 2 years after Charlemagne was crowned, the idea of reconciliation through marriage ended. The Byzantine Greeks never forgave the Pope and refused to recognize the Carolingians as emperors of the Western Roman Empire, only agreeing to write them in correspondence as Emperor of the Franks, Imperator Francorum. Interesting as the historical details are, the longer-term importance of this act of crowning Charlemagne Holy Roman Emperor takes us into the theological realm of ecclesiology. So what was the theological justification for this? The ancient Roman Empire had been administratively divided into East and West by Diocletian in 286 AD, because its immense size made proper administration very difficult. This division, subsequent to that, the empire oscillated between being united and divided, until the Western Empire simply came to an end in 476. After that, the Eastern emperors continued to refer to themselves as Roman emperors, but we're calling it Byzantine for the sake of clarity. But they continued to claim sovereignty over what had been the whole empire. So just the idea of a Western Roman emperor and an Eastern Roman emperor was not something new or controversial, even though the Byzantines didn't like it. What was new and what was controversial was the recreation of this position by the Pope and not by the Eastern Emperor. Pope Leo, at the time, did not bother to articulate a justification for it, at least not one that survived. But subsequent popes would. And we'll encounter these arguments in due course, but for now, suffice it to say that the Holy See is the ultimate moral authority in the world. It's the successor of St. Peter, Vicar of Christ. Viewing temporal and spiritual sovereignty side by side, it is clear that the spiritual is superior by nature, because the temporal ceases at death, whereas the spirit lives eternally, with the consequences of what was done in the temporal. So the temporal is not irrelevant. So the soul, the spirit, is going to live with the consequences of what was done while still here on earth. but here on earth does come to it. It's not without value, but it is not eternal also. Therefore, if the Pope interpreted the temporal situation of Western Europe to indicate that a united temporal sovereignty was in the interest of the common good, and furthermore that Charlemagne was the proper man to hold such sovereignty, because both he and his father had been such loyal defenders of church independence, then the Pope had every right to name and crown him as Western Emperor. The title was modified to Holy Roman Emperor because of the understanding that this was not simply a revival of an ancient Roman title. Rather, it was a recreation of the ancient office of emperor into one which had as its primary responsibility the temporal defense of the church in the world. Now, there is, of course, an alternate interpretation, which would cause untold harm in church history, which brings us to the unintended and unforeseen consequences of Pope Leo's action, and that is the problem of Caesaropapism in the West. Spelled Caesaropapism. The unforeseen consequence is introducing Caesaropapism into the West. Now, as seminarians remember from the patristics course, Caesaropapism is a term derived in the ancient East, used to describe the erroneous ecclesiology that inevitably grew from the erroneous Christology of Arianism. So recall, Arius denied the divinity of Christ, thereby subtracting the supernatural reality from the Messiah. Misunderstanding the nature of Christ can have no result other than misunderstanding the nature of the church founded by Christ. Since Arius saw no supernatural aspect to the Messiah, or no divine aspect to the Messiah, he also saw no divine aspect to the church, which the Messiah founded. In the Greek East, this led to a defective ecclesiology which subordinated the church to the state, believing this was divine will. And by subordination, I don't mean just paying taxes, which Jesus said we do. So, yes, we are subordinate to the government in that regard. But subordinate in the sense that secular imperial officials interfered in theological matters inside of the church, in the internal church, which Jesus did not say we have to do. We have to participate in. So by granting to a Western sovereign, even one as friendly as Charlemagne, the title of emperor, the Pope inadvertently opened the possibility that in the future, unscrupulous theologians and imperial bureaucrats would attempt to transpose the defective ecclesiology of Caesaropapism from the east to the west, meaning Caesar is above the Pope. Now, Charlemagne never pushed this, but it would happen after his death and would lead to just endless church-state disputes for the rest of the medieval period. Concurrent with this defective ecclesiology of Caesaropapism, they would develop, again long after Charlemagne and Leo were dead, but it was only possible because of this act, the concept that this ecclesiology of Caesaropapism should be applied within each realm. The result being the construction of a political theology of what would later be called the national churches, national church ecclesiology. The most clearest example of this is the Anglican Church of England, where the monarch is literally, the Queen of England, Elizabeth II is literally the head of the Church of England. So that's the fullness of Caesaropapism in the national church ecclesiology. Okay. Okay, time passed. Skip. Okay, Charlemagne was a great man, but still a man, so he was subject to death like the rest of us. That death occurred during the reign of Pope Leo III. The man who crowned him emperor, thus enabling him to fulfill his life dream. As early as 781, Charlemagne had the Pope crown his son, Louis, as King of Aquitaine in southern France, as he felt age wearing heavily on him. Charlemagne wished to ensure an orderly succession by having this same Louis crowned as co-emperor in 813. Charlemagne died of pneumonia the following year, on January 28, 814, at his favorite palace of Aachen, and that's where he's buried. His realm, which consisted of all of Western Europe, well, continental Western Europe, except Spain and Portugal, as well as into central and southern Italy. So by the time all of his wars were done, we had to skip all that, but he had Germany, Austria, what's now Switzerland, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, then down south, Austria, Slovenia, then turning down the eastern coast of the Adriatic, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Croatia. So I had some of southern and central Europe too, a huge swath of territory. All of that passed to his son Louis, the Emperor Louis I, who's called Louis the Pious in the history books. Charlemagne had other sons. You may be wondering about that. He did not abandon the Lex Salica, but his other sons, at least his other legitimate sons, who would have been eligible to inherit, all died before Charlemagne did. So it all fell to Louis I. It was also during the reign of Pope Leo III that the papacy was forced to take cognizance once again of Islam. And it's at this point that we start hearing or reading in the records reference to the Saracens. The word Saracen is derived from a Greek word zarakinos, which is an attempt, a Greek rendering of the Arabic word for Easterner. So it was a term applied by Greeks to the Bedouin Arabs of the Arabian Peninsula, who were east, from their perspective in Constantinople, they were east. This term came into Christian Latin usage after the Muslim conquest of Spain. As the Muslims were not from Spain, but from the east, Saracen was first applied to the Muslim conquerors and later applied to Muslims in general. In the same way, the term Moor, M-O-O-R, was originally derived from a North African tribe who converted to Islam and came to be applied by Europeans first to all African Muslims and later simply as another synonym for Muslim, along with Saracen. Anyway, in the time of Pope Leo III, Muslim pirates began sailing in Italian waters and even ventured raids on the Italian mainland. These pirates were referred to by the general term Saracen, even though they were just individual bands of criminals, pirates. So these were not part of the Muslim Navy, either the Umayyad Navy or the Abbasid Navy. So they were just freelancers, just gangs, but on ships. Charlemagne had sent much treasure to the Pope, taken in his conquest of the Avars, which we had to skip because he got so many wars. Anyway, Pope Leo used the money to build what we would think of as a coast guard. to protect the coastal cities, at least of the papal state, from Saracen piracy. So keep this in mind. In a future papal reign, Saracens are actually going to sack the city of Rome. And then later, they're going to do in Italy what they did in France. They're going to actually conquer the island of Sicily and conquer part of southern Italy and establish a Muslim sovereignty there at Bari. But we'll get to that in due course. Okay. In the year 778, if any of you in your English literature courses encountered the Song of Roland, that's based on a historical event that occurred in 778. And the Song of Roland is a 4,000-line poem, epic poem, about this. And it is the oldest surviving complete work of French literature. Actually, if you're interested, it's in Einhard's biography of Charlemagne, chapter 9. It's Charlemagne. So what started Vasconia, south of Aquitaine, they revolted again. And remember, Vasconia is not only south of the Garonne in France, but also south of the Pyrenees to Pamplona. So Charlemagne thought he would end it once and for all he actually crossed the Pyrenees, invaded Spain. He tried it again. He tried to form an alliance with some Muslims against others who were allied with Vasconia. And he attempted to take the city of Saragossa, got beaten badly, and had to retreat. And on the retreat, the Basques, so the Basques, or the descendants of the Vasconians, they hit the retreating army at the pass of Roncevaux, and Roland was one of the guys who was defending, and he died. So it goes on and on and on. It's long, very, very long. Anyway, Einhard talks about it in chapter 9. Let's see. Charlemagne's promotion of education. I was going to read some excerpts from Einhard and another biographer from the Middle Ages, Notker, the Stammerer, but I think I went into enough for you to see it. They both mention Alcuin. Notker calls him Albinius by his nickname, because Notker was a monk, and so was Alcuin. So it was just kind of the monastic in the network. And Notker, the monk Notker, was a student of one of Alcuin's students. And this is a letter Charlemagne wrote. No, skip that. Well, dictated. Yeah, it's too long. Okay, we will stop there. So, we'll stop with Charlemagne's death. I'll read that. So this is Einhard, chapter 30, about Charlemagne's death and the coronation of Louis. We'll do this and then we'll end. Quote, toward the close of his life, when he was broken by ill health and old age, he, meaning Charlemagne, summoned Louis, king of Aquitania, his only surviving son, by Hildegard, and gathered together all the chief men of the whole kingdom of the Franks in a solemn assembly. He appointed Louis, with their unanimous consent, to rule with himself over the whole kingdom, and constituted him heir to the imperial name. Then, placing the diadem upon his son's head, he bade him be proclaimed emperor, and was hailed by all present in favor. For it really seemed as if God had promoted him to it for the kingdom's good. It increased the king's dignity and struck no little terror in foreign nations. After sending his son back to Aquitaine, although weak from age, Charlemagne, set out to hunt, as usual, near his palace at Aachen, and passed the rest of the autumn in the chase. Returning thither about the 1st of November, this is the year 813. While wintering there, he was seized in the month of January, so bringing us to 814, with a high fever. And it started on January 22nd, and took to his bed. As soon as he was taken sick, he prescribed for himself abstinence from food, as he always used to do in case of fever, thinking that the disease could be driven off or at least mitigated by fasting. Besides the fever, he suffered from a pain in the side, which the Greeks called pleurisy. But he still persisted in fasting and in keeping up his strength only by draughts taken at very long intervals. He died January 28th, the 7th day from the time he took to his bed, at 9 o'clock in the morning, after partaking of the Holy Communion, in the 72nd year of his age and the 47th of his reign, January 28th, 814. His body was washed and cared for in the usual manner, and was then carried to the church and interred amid the greatest lamentation of all the people. There was some question at first where to lay him, because in his lifetime he had given no directions as to his burial. But at length all agreed that he could nowhere be more honorably entombed than in the very basilica that he had built in the town at his own expense. That this Aachen he's talking about. He was buried there the same day that he died, and a gilded arch was erected above his tomb with his image and an inscription. The words of the inscription were as follows: "In this tomb lies the body of Charles, the great and Orthodox emperor, who gloriously extended the kingdom of the Franks and reigned prosperously for 47 years. He died at the age of 70 in the year of our Lord 814, the 7th indiction, on the 28th day of January." Pope Leo died 2 years later on June 12, 816, after a reign of 20 years and 6 months. So we will pick up with that next time. Now, there were, of course, Carolingians after Charlemagne, but this will be it for the distinct unit on the Charlemagnes, because for reasons, as we'll see, the momentum of history after Charlemagne is going to shift into other hands, and we'll see what happens to the. So it's like the Merovingians, that there was like under Clovis, there was a time when the Merovingians were really kind of shaping history, but the dynasty lasted long after they had ceased to do that, and so that happened to the Carolingians too. So these 4 parts, that's the Carolingian unit. That's their distinctive contributions to the medieval period and to church history in general. So next we'll pick up with the papal chronology into the 9th century. So for now, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.